Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We do still have a few people logging in, so we'll give them another minute to get signed in, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, actually it looks like the logging in has slowed down, so we will go ahead and get started now. Welcome everyone, my name is Kim Brown and I'm with the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities, Transition and Employment Projects. I'll be your moderator for today. And today's webinar is sponsored by the Montana Deaf-Blind Project and is funded in whole or in part by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP. Support for the webinar is also provided through a contract with Children's Special Health Services at the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. The statements shared in today's presentation do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the sponsoring departments. All attendees are currently muted. This helps to cut down on the background noise so that everyone can hear the presenters. If you'd like to ask the presenters a question or make a comment, please type your question or comment into the chat box or the question box. And please note that only you, the moderator, myself, and the presenters will be able to see what you've typed into the box. I will go ahead and read those questions at different times throughout today's presentation, and our presenters will answer. If you don't see the chat or question box on your screen, look to the upper right-hand area of your screen, and there should be an orange box with a white arrow in it. If you click on that, it should open your dashboard, and one of the little boxes there will be called chat or questions, and that's where you can type in your questions. Again, feel free to type in your questions or comments at any time, and I will read those out to the presenters at different times throughout the presentation. For those of you who requested Montana Office of Public Instruction renewal units when you registered, those will be emailed to you after the webinar, and it can take up to a couple of weeks for us to get those emailed out. Please note that you do have to have pre-registered to receive the OPI credit, and unfortunately, we're currently unable to issue other kinds of attendance documentation. Today's session is being audio taped for the Montana Deaf-Blind Project and the Transition and Employment Project's resource libraries. The recording for today's webinar, along with the materials, will be posted to our training archives pages, and I've listed both of those in the chat box. So if you're interested in checking out any of the previous webinars in this series, take a look at, we have two links on there. One is for the Montana Deaf-Blind Project website. The other is for the Transition and Employment Project's website. All of the same materials for these webinars are posted on both of those sites, so you can choose either one and access the information. The slides for today's session and the handout for today's session are already posted on those websites if you're interested in downloading and perhaps printing those. And as soon as the recording is ready, we will get it posted as well. It can take up to a couple of weeks to get that up on the websites. We will have a survey link that pops up as soon as the webinar ends today. It's a very short, probably 8 question survey, and we do ask that you please take the time to fill that out. We look at all of the responses that we receive from these surveys, and we use them to help improve the offerings in the future. So again, please do take the time to complete that survey. And with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce and thank our speakers for today. Our main speaker today is Ellen Condon, and Ellen is the project director for the Rural Institute's Transition and Employment Projects, and also for the Montana Deaf-Blind Project, both at the University of Montana, where she has worked since 1996 on transition and employment for youth with significant disabilities. Ellen is currently working as a consultant to the National Center on Deafblindness in the area of transition to employment and community life for students with deafblindness and intellectual disabilities, as well as a consultant with Mark Gold and Associates. We also have today with us Teresa Baldry. Teresa is based in Miles City and is the project coordinator for the Montana Deaf-Blind and the Children's Special Health Services transition projects. She has worked as an assistive technology consultant for Montech and as the project coordinator for the Pre-Employment Transition Services Technical Assistance Center at the Rural Institute. Teresa is the parent of 6 children, including a son with a disability. She began her work in the disability field due to her need to understand information and systems that would directly impact her son, who is now a young adult. His need for assistive technology, including systems for communication, created opportunities to learn and share. And with that, I would like to turn the webinar over to Ellen Condon.
Thank you, Kim, and hi, everybody. I'm glad you have signed up for the third webinar of this webinar series about transition to employment. And this webinar series is a collaborative effort of 3 state deafblind projects: the Montana Deafblind Project, the Idaho Project for Children and Youth with Deafblindness, and California Deafblind Services. All states have a deafblind project that's federally funded, and we focus on the students who have a combined vision and hearing loss who are ages birth through 21. And so one of the initiatives from the National Center and for many of our state projects is looking at transition to employment and to quality adult lives for students with deafblindness and additional disabilities. So the information we'll share in these webinars is applicable to all students with ongoing support needs and a significant impact of disability, but they're definitely applicable to students who have combined vision and hearing loss. And so if you want any other information about deafblindness and about services in your state, you can either go to nationaldb.org, which is the National Center, and it will list all the state projects there, or you can visit the page that talks about the project that Teresa and I work on in the state of Montana. So as an overview of where we've been with this webinar series, the first webinar in February really talked about what is competitive integrated employment. And basically what we clarified as defined in the Rehab Act, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is that competitive integrated employment is work that's paid at minimum wage or above, working alongside people without disabilities, and there's opportunities for advancement and similar benefits to what anybody else in that type of position has. So competitive integrated employment could include self-employment. And what's new with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act is that you can access competitive integrated employment either through a traditional labor market approach, so applying for job openings and competing against other people to access those jobs, or through a customized approach to employment. So looking at who your student is in terms of skills and aptitudes, ideal conditions for success, and then negotiating with an employer for a job. So part of what we did in webinar 1 was looked at what is customized employment and how it differs. And all of these are recorded, so you can go back and revisit or share them as a series of 3 with people you're working with in your states. So in the second webinar, we started looking at what are the strategies of discovery and how do we learn about a student's strengths, interests, and support needs? Like what are the strategies we use if we're going to look at customized employment instead of the traditional labor market approach? And these webinars are focused on students. And when you think about the vocational preparation and career, exposure and career awareness that we usually do for students and students with disabilities, we typically focus on a traditional labor market approach. So part of what we're doing in this webinar series is showing you how would you look at customized employment as a strategy in the long game of getting employment for the student with significant disabilities that you're working with, but how do you use these strategies to ensure that when you're looking at work experiences for students to try out work in the community and for families to consider whether or not their son or daughter will work in the community, that we're doing it in a well-matched work experience for the student. So it really gives them a good experience and gives families a good experience, and also shows folk rehab and school staff and adult services staff and employers that students with significant disabilities have something to contribute and can work in the community. So today's webinar, what we wanted to focus on, what we're hoping is that all of you who've been attending these webinars use the information about how to do discovery and supported a student that you're working with to go out and have a work experience over the summer. And so part of what we wanted to look at today is, what did you see? What did you learn? And how do you translate that into characteristics of a really well-matched work experience for the student? And so if you didn't get your work experience together this summer, that's okay. You still have time. And also, if your school district is just starting to work with folk rehab around pre-employment transition services, work-based learning is an area that folk rehab can assist with. And it's one of the 5 required areas for students with disabilities to have access to through VR under pre-employment transition services. What I do want to clarify here is that discovery and customized employment, while they are included under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and voc rehab can provide them, and actually they are part of their menu of services now, they are not part of PREETS. PREETS is really focused on preparation and planning for future employment, and the Rehab Services Administration is still not convinced that discovery should be part of that. So part of what I want to illustrate today is, how do we do discovery, and maybe it's led by the school as the age-appropriate transition assessment, and how do we collaboratively work between the schools and voc rehab to make sure all students are accessing pre-employment transition services. So again, discovery answers the question, who is this person? And what we're looking at, what we really want to find out through discovery is where's the student at their best? Meaning, what would be the best environment where they're going to participate the most, be able to contribute the most, do things that motivate them, and be able to perform tasks that, and maybe during school we're just focusing on experiences with the goal of paid competitive integrated employment once they exit from school. So we're actually looking at activities across their daily lives, and we're using different strategies to find out about the student. And, so think about like a student with complex needs, who has long-term support needs, who has significant impacts of disability. Think of that student as a puzzle that we need to find all the pieces to be able to put the pieces together to see what this person's going to do for employment. So our goal through these strategies is to find people who know this student well, and they may not know the whole student, but they have a relationship that gives them information and insight into some part of the student. And so through facilitated discovery, you would go out and have conversations with people that know them well. And you wouldn't be looking for that person's opinion of what the student could do or not do for employment. You're looking for information. And so think of discovery as a big funnel with the big end at the top, and you're collecting all this information from people who know the student well and from observations you do of the student and time you spend with them doing activities that they like, that are familiar, and then some unfamiliar activities. And also activities where they're at their best and maybe most independent. And also I'd be looking at spending time with a student or observing them in a situation where they have the most support needs. So you get a picture of the whole spectrum of who this student is. But what you're doing is looking for factual, descriptive information about what the student does and how they do it. And then that information gets filtered down through the funnel. And then later in discovery, you, with the help of people who know that student well, will figure out what all that information you collected means. So discovery is not handing out a form or a checklist to family or to teachers and saying, fill this out and tell me what you think your student's good at and what they can do for employment. It's actually rethinking about what we think we know about the student. So even if this is somebody you've known for years, even if this is your son or daughter, what we encourage you to do in the process of discovery is go back and re-look at them through a different set of lenses. And those lenses allow you to just see factual information and collect it so that we can then re-look at it and say, okay, what do these facts lead us to think about the student's interests, about tasks that they can do for an employer, about contributions they could make, and about the ideal conditions for success. So we don't want you to go out and ask people's opinions of somebody's strengths, needs, and ideal conditions yet, and what they'll do for work. We want you to ask them for descriptive information. So discovery is also not holding a person-centered planning meeting to collect people's opinions. What discovery is going out and finding and identifying that factual descriptive information about who this student is, what they do, and then from there, identifying strengths, interests, needs. And so discovery is not an evaluation or an assessment about whether or not somebody can work in competitive integrated employment. We assume that anybody, even with the most significant impact of disability, has something to contribute to an employer. It's up to us, the professionals, to figure out where, meaning what environment's going to be a good match, what tasks the person's going to do, and how they're going to do it. So we're really, for students, we're really looking at using discovery to identify the ideal characteristics of a work experience. Because if everybody, when we look at WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, basically VR is being directed to spend 15% of their state budget on students and making sure that all students have the opportunity to try out competitive integrated employment. So if we're working with a student with a significant impact of disability, we want to make sure that we know enough about them so that we can custom tailor a work experience so that they get a true feel for what work looks like. Not for where they're in over their head or they, it's an inaccessible environment for them so they can't even participate other than just sitting there and watching their fellow students work. We really want to make sure the work experience is meaningful. So the student, the family, and the professionals who are supporting them really get a feel for, what work could look like for this person. So when we're thinking about conditions for success, that's basically any feature of support, of the environment, of certain tasks that need to be in place for the student or this individual to be successful. Interests would be anything that motivates that person to participating in that work or that type of work. And that may be really hard to ascertain for students who, don't have a recognized communication system, who have had very limited experiences. Figuring out what they're interested in for work may be really difficult. And so we're going to give you some examples of things to try. The other piece that we want to find out from information that we collect in discovery is, what can this student contribute? what skills or attributes or experiences, specialized training or knowledge, what are those things that are going to help them be attractive to an employer? And part of this, the lucky thing in getting to work with students is that ideally we can be working with students as young as 16. And in some states, students have access to education through 21. In some states like Michigan, it's up to 26. We have a lot of time to actually build this list of interests and contributions, and then also tasks that the student can offer a future employer. And we can build that task list for a student throughout their transition service years. So what could be included in ideal conditions for success? It might be based on this person's vision. What do their work materials need to look like? Do they need to be, a high contrast color? Is this person totally blind? So they need a different way to identify their work materials and orient themselves to their work environment. So maybe it's characteristics or accommodations, or maybe it's support for them through a person or a coworker. What about hearing? How does this person's hearing loss, how does that dictate what accommodations they need or what their work environment needs for them to be able to access information, communicate with coworkers, communicate with a supervisor? Physical access. Does somebody use crutches or a cane or a wheelchair to navigate? And so what does that mean in terms of accessible workspace and environment, restrooms, access to coworkers? And then also, what kind of communication supports do people need to participate in their work environment? Other sensory needs might be, do people need to get up and move around? Is that part of their ideal conditions for success? Do they need to be able to be loud when they're agitated and have that not impact their job? Do certain smells not work for somebody, or lighting? All of those things we're going to learn about through discovery and through ongoing time with the student throughout the transition process. All of this, you're going to be collecting information throughout, and the picture of who this student is, it's going to grow and it's going to evolve, just like all of us did when we were in our teenage years and our first exposures to work. Hopefully we're not the same person who had the first paid job when we first started working as we are now. And it's going to be the same for students with disabilities. The other thing we're trying to learn through work experiences and discovery is, what does the student's long-term support needs look like? And I don't want the answer to be they're always going to need a one-to-one with them. That may be how we choose to meet their support needs, but what I'd rather have you look for is, what is their long-term support? What does it look like? Is it that they need information about anything that changes in their environment? Is it that they need somebody to help translate their communication to people who don't understand their communication in their work environment? Is it that they need ongoing personal care? Or are there some safety issues that they need long-term support with? I'm not saying that people with long-term support needs can't work. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that if we can really describe what those long-term support needs are, it frees us up in transition planning to think about different ways to meet those needs. And so as we're connecting with adult agencies and negotiating how to get those long-term support needs met, we can be more creative in how to meet them. So other things that are included in characteristics or ideal conditions of a workplace might be things to avoid. Are there certain things that really don't work for this person? And again, this may change over time. Is there a specific flow to tasks that work? For one person we've worked with, she likes to do her hard task first, followed by 2 easier tasks. And her mom was the one who explained that to us. Other people like to be able to choose the order of their tasks. Sometimes people just want it to be the same order all the time of predictable tasks. And then is this somebody who works best with knowing, okay, I do this task from this time to this time, and then once that time is up, I move to the next task? Or are they somebody who has to finish a task and then move to the next task? Proximity to coworkers. Sometimes a condition might be that people want to be around coworkers, and part of it is a safety support. Or sometimes a coworker who's just in the general vicinity can notice if that person needs something, if there's somebody who doesn't tend to initiate asking for help or saying that they're in need. And I've worked with other people who basically need 2 arms length between their workspace and all the other coworkers, just based on who they are at their best. Time of day might be another condition, and it might be based on medication side effects. It might be based on when the best qualified staff to support you at a work experience are available. Or it might be a better time of day within that work environment. Or it might be you don't sleep at all at night, and so starting work early in the morning isn't going to be you at your best because you're going to be exhausted. Also, what kind of emotional support do you need? And again, these are characteristics for the ideal setting. And you don't want to put you don't want to list in here everything that might be nice. You want to list features that have to be in place or have to be absent for you to be successful on the job. Because the longer your list of conditions is, the more you narrow down the field of where you need your work experience to take place or your future job. And so the other one that we'll always run into is transportation. How are you going to get to work, and how does that impact when you can do a work experience? How far does transportation go? Does it run only certain hours of the day but not on holidays and weekends? Or are you commuting with a neighbor, and so there's a certain direction where you can do your work experience because it's based along their route to work? And so why this is important, again, is when somebody's ideal characteristics are met, they look really competent and confident in a work setting. And so this is a young woman that I worked with when she was in high school. And she's a young adult now, probably mid-30s. And this was her first work experience. And her team was really clear about what her ideal characteristics for participation in a work experience were. She used senior transit because that was the only accessible transit to get her in a wheelchair to work. She wanted to work at Walmart as her first work experience. How her body worked is that she can grasp anything with her right hand as long as it wasn't over 3 to 5 pounds and it wasn't any wider than the width of her hand from her fingers to her thumb. Her chair was able to rise and lower, so she could put anything back on any of these shelves except the bottom shelf, as long as it wasn't too big or too heavy. If it was, she could figure out where the department manager was, and she could bring that item to the manager and bring it to their attention. And so this particular task was a fabulous match. She was the ultimate shopper, and like part of her motivation for getting to do a work experience at Walmart was that she could see all the new things that she could possibly buy once she got a paycheck. And so she would memorize the layout of the store, and it really disturbed her if something was out of place. And so that was a huge contribution. So unfortunately, when the team initially went, they were so excited that Walmart was, willing to let this person come and do an experience at the store, that when the employer offered the task of unboxing shoes that just were shipped in and taking the stuffing out and basically putting the shoes back in the box and putting them back on the shelves, they were so excited. And they didn't really think through, does that meet Carley's conditions? So the first day I went up there to watch her working, I was at the end of the aisle and I'm looking, and basically how the task was done is that you take a box of shoes that's just come in out of the bigger box. You remove the lid, and so that requires you to hold the bottom of the lid with one hand and then kind of wiggle the top back and forth to get it out. So it's a two-handed task. Then you place the top on the bottom. So when you put the shoes back on the shelf, it's going to be an open box. You can see them. And then the next step is to reach in and remove one shoe, hold it in one hand, and with the other hand, remove all the stuffing and those sticks they put in there for structure. Throw that stuff out. Do that with both shoes, arrange them, and then place them back on the shelf. And so as I'm watching Carley do her work experience, I'm watching the paraprofessional pick the box up out of the bigger box, remove the lid and place it on the bottom. And Carley is smiling because she's getting to watch all the shoes and this is really exciting, but her hands aren't on the task. And so it's, again, the para picks up one shoe, removes the stuffing, picks up the other shoe, removes the stuffing. She can hand it to Carley and Carley can throw it in the box, but it doesn't really look like Carley's making much of a dent in this work experience. And so as I'm watching, I'm also watching other customers watch and thinking, oh gosh, what must they be thinking? They're probably thinking, wow, it's so nice for Walmart to give this poor disabled kid, an opportunity to get out of the classroom. But Carley is not sending the message of how brilliant she is and how capable she is because she's just sitting there. And the fault is on us, the professionals, who haven't taken the ideal characteristics and help the employer think through what tasks would be a good experience for Carley and would be challenging to Carley. So Carley ended up doing a work experience. We went in and renegotiated, and I think I just kind of coached the team through it. And this was one of the first work experiences and jobs that they later negotiated. But it was the mom, a paraprofessional, and a teacher who didn't have a lot of experience with employment. And they went back in and renegotiated and basically gave the employer a list of different things that Carley could put away on all the shelves within all the departments. And this later turned into a paid job for her. And it was all based around her contributions to the employer, because she made distinct contributions and was a fabulous worker as long as the customized job met her conditions. So if we don't take the time to think through setting up a well-matched experience, the student looks less competent. The community gets the wrong impression of the student's capabilities and support needs. It looked like she had so much support need when she was there in a task that she couldn't physically do. And she did. She required somebody to be with her to do the physical pieces that she couldn't do. But when we changed the task, she was there on her own. The job coach totally faded once she learned the job. But also the student gets the idea too that they need somebody with them all the time. And we need to, that's going to be individualized based on who the student is. And their needs could be met through different strategies. And that's part of what we want to experiment with during transition, so that we really have a clear picture of what we need from adult service agencies as the student's graduating. And if those services aren't readily available, it helps us come up with, we're a whole lot easier to be creative in how we're going to meet those ongoing support needs. The other piece is that families really get to see a student's full potential when they're in a well-matched job versus one that doesn't fit. Another big hazard would be safety. If we don't do a good job matching somebody based on their conditions for success, we could miss something critical, and the person could be unsafe or the community could be unsafe. So we want to be really careful about that. The other thing is that in an ideal world, we don't judge whether or not a student can work or not work and whether or not they're ready for competitive employment if we're using a customized strategy. But in reality, some of our service systems are still evolving to that value. And so we want to make sure that if somebody is judging whether or not they should invest in additional work experiences and support for somebody to work in the community, we want to make sure that they see the person at their best. Because what if this is the only time this individual gets to try out community work and somebody makes a decision on their readiness for employment based on that? So again, this is another young person who, when matched in a setting that really met his conditions for success, he was super successful. And unfortunately, it was only a work experience. It was so late in his transition services that he ended up graduating a couple days or a couple weeks later and didn't have services and supports in place from adult agencies that could help him pursue employment. But this young man's family was really afraid of him being out in the community and afraid that he needed to be in a supervised setting all the time. And as we explored more about what they meant, like what were their fears, they were actually okay if he was in a community work setting where people had their eyes on him and would know if he left that building really quickly, or and also someplace where he didn't interact with a lot of strangers because they were afraid that, you know, somebody would take him or he'd wander off and he would get hurt or get abused or something. So part of what discovery entailed was figuring out really what the parents' fears were and the support needs, and then really looking at how could we meet those needs within a given work environment. And the environment where he was working was an auto parts store where all the tellers faced, they were, you know, behind a long counter and they all faced the floor and he was out on the floor. And so everybody was faced toward him and they would notice if he wasn't there, if he left, and they would also notice customers interacting with him. And so that, you know, a setting like that would work for the parents. So what about if somebody's interests aren't clear? Like what if somebody's not had much life experience or they can't communicate what they like or don't like? You know, part of what we need to do, especially for students with a real significant impact of disability, is we need to look for really minute signs. Like it might be like, where does the student's attention go? And what is it about what they're attending to that we think is motivating to them or interesting to them? Do they smile in some situations and look, you know, frown or look unhappy in other situations, and figure out what is it about those situations that they like or don't like? Do they attend, or does their body get still in certain situations, like maybe where there's music? And you may be thinking, well, how's that an interest area? You know, it may be that for somebody to just participate in a work task, we need to add something in that'll to get their attention while they're learning to perform a task. So for somebody that a colleague of mine worked with in Texas, basically she would operate a switch that actually performed stapling, and that was her task. But she was motivated to do it because initially the switch turned on music and she really liked music. She had no interest or no, I guess, experience with the task of stapling, but then the music was faded. Somebody I worked with in Washington State, as they basically came up with the idea that this person would be really interested if using a switch actually turned on these lights, because that was the part that was really reinforcing to them. But then that also got them interacting with the switch that operated something that was a work task. So sometimes we may just have to go with, what can the student do? The other piece too is that some students, maybe they're not a big fan of new unfamiliar activities. So giving them more time to see if they actually like it or don't like it once it becomes more familiar. And again, we've got to try a bunch of different things for students who have had no experience. For this young woman, we couldn't, when we would ask her open-ended questions about where she might like to work for her first experience, we weren't getting much back. And so the mom was thinking, and she and I were talking one day, and then we were like, oh my gosh, like the woman really likes to participate in theater productions. And so there's a lot of different nonprofit businesses across all of our communities, and they're always looking for volunteers. What a great unpaid work experience. And what a great way for people to make some connections in the community. But again, let's make sure it's a well-matched position. So this young woman was also working on her communication skills and making sure that she communicated in a voice tone that people would hear her. So she ended up, her first work experience was in a theater as an usher. So the other thing we need to do as we're looking at what to offer for tasks or what to set up for tasks in a work experience is thinking beyond the obvious. I got to work with a team out in Washington, and when we asked how this woman who was the job seeker spent her time, basically she spent a lot of time with, those kind of rubbery plastic placemats that have the holes around the outside. And then what you do is you kind of weave this plasticky thread through them. She would spend hours every day doing that. And so as we're getting to know people and capturing information of what they do in their daily lives, we don't want to say, okay, so that's what we saw her do, so how do we turn that into a work task? What we want to do instead is say, okay, what does that activity tell us about her skills, about her interests, about potential tasks? So instead of just looking for the literal thing that you see, try to translate it into some other information. So we looked at how she used her hands. We looked at the fact that she liked to be busy. She liked to make things. And then we looked at, okay, so what other, given other tools, what would be some other work tasks that she could do? Could this translate into sewing? Could this translate into, helping in an alteration business? Are there things, are there small tools and, requiring like hand-eye coordination that this woman would be really skilled at? So how do we translate from what we find in discovery into interests, skills, and tasks? And then this is a great example of somebody who we just didn't really know where to go with interests. The person hadn't had much experience. It was hard to follow her lead because she doesn't navigate independently. She needed a lot of support to just move her motorized chair. She was working on driving it herself and could drive it using the head array behind her head to go forward and to stop. But if she started veering off to the side, somebody would need to overcorrect and get the chair kind of righted again on the direction. So you couldn't really follow her lead to see what she was interested in. So where we started with her was looking at, okay, what tasks could she do? And so as you can see from this picture, she's got a Big Mac switch in front of her. And she's also got a head switch that's mounted behind her head that she could hit with her right cheek. And so thinking about the Big Mac, sometimes we can look at, okay, so what is the person's technology that they physically could access? And this woman can reach out with her left hand and press something. She's not going to be able to isolate a finger to press it, but she could hit it with her hand. And so thinking about, okay, so what can the Big Mac do? It can turn things off and on, and it could deliver pre-recorded messages. Then if you have multiple Big Macs, you would have multiple messages. So if we started with that, then we could start generating a list of tasks that she could try. We also noticed from watching her and watching where her attention went was that she loved watching people. She wanted to know what was going on. She tried to advocate for her other classmates. And so as we were looking for a work experience for her, we had to figure out where could she offer tasks that needed to be done in a community setting, and then also what would be a setting that held her interest. And so she lived in the same community that I live in now, and it's pretty rural. We probably only have like 10 public businesses. But her first work experience was totally negotiated based on her conditions and also tasks that she could do. And so she ended up offering stapling and hole punching to the health club, and they were at that point they had all hard copy membership applications. And so the other thing that was critical was that it was a physically accessible work site. It was a task that could be done when she was able to do it, because based on her health, she could work 20 minutes, then she needed to take about a 20-minute break where she kind of laid back in her chair, and then she could work another 20 minutes. And that's what she could offer at first. Her stamina built up over time, and by the end of the summer, she was actually working 2 hours. But we had to look at, okay, what is she able to do physically, and how do we use her technology to generate a list of tasks? And so once we get tasks, we want to make sure that we don't give people life sentences on any one task. Just because you figured out that somebody was able to use a shredder doesn't mean that's the only task they can do forever. So again, let's try to be like, let's not get stuck in the literal, but figure out what is it about that task that worked for the person. Was it the vibration that was really motivating to them? Was it the fact that it was really obvious you had a big pile of things that need to be shredded, and so it was super reinforcing when your pile went down to 0? Or was it a task that could be done seated? You know, part of that we just need to figure out, and part of it may be coming up with different theories and testing them out to see where we're right and what does work for a person. But then we need to figure out, okay, so what's the next task they can try? So this is another young man who was part of our deafblind project years ago in Montana. And when we first started looking for work experiences for him, things that we knew about him was that he really enjoyed watching trucks. There were really low expectations of what he would do either during the day in the classroom or as a young adult once he stopped going to school anymore. He liked to visit briefly with familiar people. His words were hi, bye, and no. He didn't have an alternative communication system, unfortunately, so that was the extent of his interactions. And people were really drawn to him. He had this great smile that people really liked, and so people in the public really liked engaging with Lance. So we were looking for some sort of task in a business where he could make deliveries along a familiar route. And so we couldn't find an office building that was large enough that would need that task. So we ended up partnering with a local bakery, and he and his family ended up creating a business. And initially the bakery did all his accounting for him. And so people from this one company would call and they'd place orders, and then he would be the sole delivery person for 1 or 2 days a week at that business. And the bakery would tack on delivery fees, and those would all be his. And so, you know, in the delivery business, because he's deafblind, his vision was never going to allow him to drive. So he ended up having to have a driver as a support person. And I did his initial business plan. And when I ran the numbers, his business could have generated enough money to pay somebody to drive him around. In the end, he did this as a school work experience. And then when he graduated, he did get developmental disability services. And so the family chose to use that funding to have somebody from the agency support him and drive him in his van to the business and do the deliveries. And so self-employment may work for somebody. It might be a good option or it might not. It's just yet another choice of how to access competitive integrated employment. So as we're looking at IDEA 2004, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, these are the requirements that guide schools around transition. And the feds are saying that IEP teams must now include transition planning in the first IEP in which the student turns 16 or younger if appropriate. A lot of states still start at age 14, which gives you more time. But in each person's transition plan, there's got to be measurable post-secondary goals around training, around education and employment, and where appropriate, independent living. So those goals are determined by age-appropriate transition assessments that identify the student's strengths, interests, preferences. And so part of the challenge for students with a significant impact of disability is that a lot of our age-appropriate transition assessments identify everything they can't do or how they compare to other people, some of the formal ones. So part of what I'd like to encourage you to do is explore some of the informal age-appropriate transition assessments. Many states have tried the process of discovery and capturing that information in various formats as the age-appropriate transition assessment that helps identify students' strengths, interests, support needs. It's going to give you information about community living, supports needed at home, as well as ideas for community employment. And unfortunately with IDEA, it doesn't really emphasize or encourage schools to really think with high expectations of post-school outcomes. It's just got to be a measurable post-school outcome. It doesn't need to be like something with high expectations at all. So as we're looking at some of the other legislature and policy out there now, like WIOA, which is, was signed in 2014, they're really like looking at offering everybody the chance to try out competitive integrated employment. And then looking at some of the employment first policies from various states. I think there's 46 states in the country that do have some form of employment first policy or legislation. States really vary in how strong that is and the precedent it sets for people. But again, there's this push to really think about everybody should have access to the community regardless of the significance of their disability. So if we're going to try and push the bar a little bit in transition and school for students with significant disabilities, we really need to be looking at using age-appropriate transition assessments that highlight what the possibilities of what students can do. And I think the process of discovery really fits well with an optimistic post-secondary goal. And when you look at this chart, like on the bottom, like the current levels of performance, discovery is going to give you a picture of who the student is, what their support needs are, what their interests are. It's going to help you identify settings that work for the student, but it's also going to identify skills that could be taught. What about more, self-directing at your workplace? What about, increasing communication skills so you can communicate with coworkers and supervisors? Also as part of transition services, you're looking at various experiences. And so those are going to include work experiences. And then also, the other piece is that the transition services help your support staff think about different strategies, alternate strategies to perform various community or work activities so that you can participate in the community and you are contributing. You don't have to be doing it the same way that everybody else is doing it. The other piece that's really critical in transition planning for students with ongoing support needs is figuring out which agencies may or may not be able to meet your needs once you exit high school. And then many agencies have long waiting lists. And so if we're really clear about what those ongoing support needs look like, we can be more clever and creative in how we meet those. But I think also that really helps families advocate for what they need for their adult son or daughter. And so age-appropriate transition assessments can either show you what's missing from the glass or what's in the glass. And so I really encourage schools to really look at how do you incorporate discovery as an age-appropriate transition assessment? How do we encourage interviewing families about what a student does at home to as an age-appropriate transition assessment? And observation summaries from students' work experiences are also examples of age-appropriate transition assessments that are informal. And if you're looking for more information, NTAC, the National TA Center on Transition, has a whole age-appropriate transition assessment toolkit, which does list discovery as a good quality age-appropriate transition assessment for people with more significant support needs. So pretty much, in discovery, again, and I think I've pointed this out a couple times, is that we're looking for rich information and we're looking for descriptive information, and it's non-judgmental. We want you to describe and factually tell how the student does something, how support's provided. It helps us identify what the real conditions are for success and also what the support needs are. And discovery is optimistic. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. It doesn't gloss over needs, but you're looking at, for this person to be successful, what needs to be in place. But it's non-evaluative. And one thing Teresa pointed out as we were getting ready for this webinar, she was talking about how just engaging with a family and a student in the process of discovery really helps raise the expectations and really helps the family start to see things differently, because how frequently have families been approached with, this assessment shows everything your son or daughter can't do? Whereas instead, discovery's looking at what the possibilities are, what they can do, and what supports will enable this person to be at their best. So a concept that Mark Golden Associates uses is called expanded discovery. And there's some different pilot projects. Source America has the Pathways to Employment project. The first site was in Salt Lake City, Utah, and now there's a site in Ogden, Utah, a site in Virginia, in Detroit, and Boston, I think, is the other site. And basically what they do is they do discovery with a job seeker, and some of these are students, some are folks who've already been in the sheltered workshop for quite a while. Some people have been on the waiting list for adult services for a while, and some people are just their students now. And basically they do discovery. They come up with the characteristics of ideal conditions of a workplace. They come up with different career clusters that this person wants to try, and they custom tailor a work experience for that person. And through that work experience, they're still doing discovery. They're learning more information about the person. And I think this model fits really well with transition. We're working with students who haven't had much experience yet. They're young, and who they are in terms of work it's going to change and evolve over the course of their high school and 18 to 20-year-old, 21-year-old high school experiences. But part of what the school needs to do is figure out, like, how do you capture this information? What do you do with this information? And so again, I'm gonna encourage you not to jump to conclusions too soon and overgeneralize what you are learning. I've worked with various job coaches, and I remember one saying, well, he doesn't like clerical work. And so I was like, well, what did you see that made you make that statement? And then when we really broke it down, it really had nothing to do with clerical work. It was this one particular office where he did the work experience. There were certain things that didn't work about it. So be really, really cautious, because a lot of job seekers with disabilities get these reputations for what they can't do or what they don't like or what they won't do. And a lot of times that information is pretty negatively slanted. And we really want to stay away from that, because people can do a whole lot more. And when our expectations are raised, their performance goes right with it. A lot of times we hear somebody can't work alone. And then when you hear the person describe the situation that led them to come up with that conclusion, what you realize is the parameters of the task were so obscure and abstract. And this person does really well if you give them concrete expectations and information, that you realize it has nothing to do with working alone. It just has to do with really fuzzy expectations don't work for this person, because they don't know when they're done, they don't know when they're successful, and that makes them really anxious. So they'll just walk away and tell you they're done. And so it looks like they can't work alone at first glance, but if you dig a little deeper, what you realize is that's not the case at all. Hearing that somebody needs a job coach with them all the time to stay on track, let's look at them in different contexts and see, do they need information? Do they need clarity about what's next? Do they need to learn a strategy to figure out what to do when they don't know what's next? Do they need to learn to ask people for assistance or what's next? But let's really analyze kind of these opinions we have about people and about students, so that we don't pigeonhole them, and also so that we don't really under-challenge people and prevent them from having the opportunity to work in the community. So, explore what those assumptions are, and really try and turn those assumptions about support needs or lack of ability into, maybe it's really about a condition for success. So there was one person who people were saying he requires staff supervision at all times to be appropriate with women, avoid wandering off, and to remain on task. So after some work experiences, what we did learn about this person is that some of his early work experiences were in an environment that was mostly male, and he learned a lot of colorful language and some inappropriate behavior around women. And so what we did find, though, is that if his supervisor was really clear about what was okay and what wasn't okay at the job site, and nipped it in the bud if something was inappropriate, he was perfectly fine and followed that expectation. However, if it was a little vague and gray, it didn't work too well for him. Thinking about assumptions about somebody needs to be in a supervised setting. Like, part of discovery is teasing out, what does that person's support needs look like? What's real? What's fictitious? And are they the same across every environment, or are certain environments, do they work really well for her and they're safe in terms of what parents are thinking is safe or not safe, or the team is thinking. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how to capture what you learned. But we want to make sure that, when somebody's doing an experience or we're collecting information about them in Discovery, that it's really descriptive and factual. One really easy way to do that when you don't have a lot of time, or you have staff that are really reluctant or are not real skilled at writing, just take some pictures, take some video with your phone, share that. And even if it's not, captured long term, if it's shared with the team at the IEP meeting or during the age-appropriate transition assessment, have the special ed teacher capture it into the person's file. And making sure that we continue to learn about what the ideal conditions for success are, what preferred and non-preferred tasks are and why, what the person's contributions are, and let's keep growing a list of tasks that they could offer employers. And also not tasks that they've just done, but tasks we know they could do if we were to teach them systematically. So I'm not seeing the chat box right now, but do we have any questions at this point, Kim? Or should I just keep going?
Hi, Ellen. We haven't had any questions come in yet.
Okay. Okay, then I'm going to keep going. If you have a question or a comment, go ahead and plug it in there. Otherwise, we'll stop again at the end, which is growing ever closer. But I still want to make sure I get to some of the links to show you some of the resources that we pulled together to augment what you're doing for work experience and discovery with your students. But think about, why we're going to do work experiences in school. We want to set the expectation that even students with a significant impact of disability can work. And so thinking about, are we having middle school students and elementary school students do tasks and have expectations throughout the school. Long before high school, we can be setting that expectation that students initiate things, that they participate, that they have ownership for some classroom tasks. It's always giving us information about support needs for an individual with a significant impact of disability in different ways that they can participate in tasks. It also helps us identify things that need to be worked on as part of transition planning or within the classroom. And also exposing students to a variety of tasks helps them identify what they're interested and not interested in. And there's so many other things that we can be working on with students within a work experience, like communication. There's so many activities and opportunities for somebody to use a device to talk with people who they don't know and who don't read their communication, who don't know them. People can learn about money and what it means and what it does and what it buys. And, thinking about, in schools, oftentimes students don't need to manage their time because there's bells and there's so many natural cues that students can just follow and get from one place and one activity to the next. However, in a workplace, they're going to need to know how to manage their time. So how do we teach some of that? And if they don't read and respond to a clock or a watch or a phone that tells them time, how do we come up with different activities or different strategies that help them manage their time and transition from one task to another? There's so many different things you can do with an iPad or a phone to help with time management and self-direction, that we should be incorporating all of that into transition. Figuring out how people get to and from work. For people who don't drive, that's going to be the forever question. So we might as well start working on it in transition rather than waiting for when they stop riding the school bus. And so, also understanding the expectations of work. how to take a break, that a break is time limited, that when you have a job, you're supposed to show up, or you call up if you're not going to show up. How do you request time off? How do you follow a schedule, especially when there's things on that schedule you don't really want to do? And reading, writing, using a computer, there's so many things, academic skills that you can work on within a work experience. And then learning about specific job tasks. So again, strategies to promote independence. I think even for students with significant disabilities, we need to give them some control over their environment. What kind of communication strategies do they need to use so they can ask their boss for help instead of their paraprofessional? How can they determine when it's time to get cleaned up for work, or time to, within a class, that it's time to get ready to go to their work experience? How do they learn to respond to alarms on a phone or an iPad that helps them identify what's next? And I think we're doing a huge disservice if we're assuming that a paraprofessional or an adult is always going to be Velcroed to somebody and that's the best strategy. There's lots of ways to teach skills of self-direction and independence. And then sometimes it may be negotiating with a coworker to provide assistance to the student or young adult rather than the paid school person. And again, it's teaching students to interact with people on the work site instead of always with a paid professional who's with them. So, other questions that we want to keep asking as we're getting to know possibilities and understand what employment can look like for a student. Are there environments where the student works for longer periods of time on their own than other environments? And what is it about? Is it about that task or that environment that promotes that? Are there things the student does without being asked to do them? Does that indicate an interest or a motivation? Are they different in one context to the next? Are there communication strategies that helps them, interact and receive assistance or request assistance from somebody who doesn't understand them or isn't familiar with them? Are there environments that a family would feel that their adult child was safe or not safe? And what are the parameters around that? So we can help really explore what's going to be a good match. And so sharing what you learned, I'm going to give you a link to a visual resume. Always consider video clips of what a student does during a work experience. One, for students who have usable vision that can see that video and watch themselves at work, that's pretty neat. But also sharing that with families, sharing that with future adult providers or with voc rehab, that would be fabulous. It just gets people on the same page of the possibility of employment for everybody. Letters of recommendation from employers or from mentors at a workplace could be really powerful. And then as part of IDEA, students are supposed to graduate with a summary of performance that identifies what they're working on and successful strategies. All of this information could be included in a summary of performance. So let me go to the visual resume resource, and this is something that I helped put together for Mark Golden Associates. The first link is an article about the visual resume, and then the second link is a link to the Mark Golden Associates website, which is under here. Are you guys seeing this now on the side of my screen?
This is Kim Ellen, and I can see the visual resume on the right-hand side of the screen on my audience view.
Okay, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to get it over onto my main screen. Huh. can make it smaller, but I can't make it bigger. Okay, so basically this link, and you guys you can follow it on your own and be more successful than I am being right now with it. But basically it's pictures and narrative about who this young woman is, and it talks about all the different job tasks that she's had. And in the first picture, it's actually a picture of her selling pot holders that she's made at home, and this is something that she and all her siblings have done. They make pot holders to give them away as gifts, but then she turned it into a small business and sells them at the local farmer's market. And then she's very active in swimming and violin, and then she also sells her pot holders at various businesses. And so the families come up with ways to help her communicate with the managers, because her speech isn't always easy to understand. And so she has a backup strategy where she will write a script herself, and then she'll read that message, and then if the employer doesn't understand, she shares the handwritten note with them so they know what she was saying. And then they realize also that she's written the note herself, and so it helps boost their vision of how competent she is. And then there's also pictures of her various work experiences and information that was learned. So that's one strategy that you can use to share information. And we used to use it at her IEP meetings to kind of set off the tone of who she was and what her strengths were, what her interests were, and to kind of help drive the need for additional work experiences and because the mother pretty much drove the work experiences versus the school. And this was long before WIOA, but ideally now VR and the schools are taking much more of a lead. And then the Mark Golden Associates Profile Part 3, I just wanted to show this to you. And again, it's not coming up how I would like it. Okay, so it's still in the corner, but it's really big. So again, you have the link to successfully get there without me. And so basically there's just some really good questions on the profile. And this is where you capture and share your information from discovery. But basically, like under the conditions for success, it helps ask you like, okay, so what are some general conditions for this job seeker? In the job seeker's opinion, what about for family? What about around task performance, instructional strategies, environmental conditions, supervisory strategies? It just really helps prompt your thinking about all the information you could be gleaning and what you could really learn from a work experience as you're doing this as part of transition. And then the other link is the Rural Institute Work Experience Resources. And so again, that brings you to our website, and there's lots of information here. There's PREETs, self-employment, Social Security, customized employment, health, alternatives to guardianships, articles and products. And then there's forms and tools as well. And so there's several resources on work experiences there that might be helpful. And so we are just wrapping up now, and we still have time for questions if there are any, but we just wanted to make sure that you know that this was brought to you by the Montana Deafblind Project in partnership with the Idaho and California Deafblind Projects as well, and also from the Montana Transition Resources Children's Special Healthcare Services. So we aren't able to do webinars unless we have funders that are supporting our time and development of the materials. So, do we have any questions?
We do not yet, but just a reminder to anyone who would like to ask a question, you're welcome to type your question into the chat or the question box. And if you're not seeing that on your screen, look at the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and there should be an orange box with a white arrow inside of it. If you click on that, it should open your dashboard, and one of the options will say either chat or questions, and you can type whatever you would like to ask Ellen in there, or if you have any comments that you would like to make. And while we're giving folks a chance to type that in, just a reminder that a short survey will appear as soon as the webinar ends, and please do take the time to complete that. And also that the recording from today's webinar will be posted on the 2 different archives web pages, and I've posted the URLs or the website addresses for those in the chat box. It can take a week or so to get those posted. The materials from today are already posted there, the slides, as well as a work experience handout that Ellen made available to us. So I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Okay, well, while we don't have questions, let's go to the other handout, which is just another form or format for capturing information from work experiences. And so when we were doing, this was years ago, obviously, I think 2007 and earlier, we had some funding through, a blank on what it was. The funding allowed us to pilot volunteer opportunities in nonprofits for middle school students with disabilities. And so we helped a couple middle schools identify nonprofits throughout their community. And then we did job analyses in each of the nonprofit sites and identified tasks and work expectations and things that the student could learn, and we could learn about the student. And then this was an example of an observation summary of one of the students at the end of the work experience. And so each experience lasted about 6 weeks or a semester, just depending on the employer and the student. And so this is just a form and a format that you are so welcome to borrow. But what you can see is that I tried to write descriptively. I tried to capture information about the student's performance so that we could then look back on it and say, okay, what were his skills? What did we learn about him? What was specific about the environment that we learned worked for him or didn't work for him? What strengths and interests became apparent from this time at this experience? Anything that he disliked or needed to be avoided? Supports the person needed? Any critical job factors? The learning style? And all of this can be used as an age-appropriate transition assessment. And it's just a collection of information from what we learned about the student at that particular experience. And then, based on this experience, what are our recommendations for future experiences? What do we want to work on? What questions do we need to answer? What do we need to explore? Or what does the student want to explore next? And so it's another way to capture the information so that as the student's transitioning to an adult service provider, they don't need to recreate the wheel. They don't need to relearn this information. And/or families can also see some of the positive pieces of how the student performed in a work experience. And again, it just sets the expectation that work's an option for everybody. So that is one of your handouts. And then also there's a blank form if you go to the Rural Institute website, which is one of the links within your handouts.
When we have just one comment that has come in, and it's just thanking you, Ellen, for the great information and the examples and the resources, especially the visual resume examples, and saying that the commenter is looking forward to checking them out.
Excellent.
And I wondered, Teresa, was there anything that you had wanted to add to Ellen's presentation?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to listen to Ellen as well, because of how much she does share around discovery and that unique work experience and how important success is.
Thanks, Teresa.
Any final comments, Ellen?
No, I guess if anybody out there has any great examples of what schools are doing for work experience for students with significant impact of disability, or what Voc Rehab is doing in terms of pre-ETS, I would love to connect with you. Through my role at the National Center on Deafblindness, we are trying to identify some examples out there around the country to share with some of our state deafblind projects. So if you know of any, please shoot me an email, and I will happily interview them and get them some nice exposure. Or not, if they prefer not.
All right, well, thank you again to our presenter. Thanks, Ellen, for all of the fabulous information, to Teresa for the information that we shared, the three of us, ahead of today's webinar that then Ellen was able to bring into the presentation. And thank you especially to all of our audience members for joining us today. We don't currently have other webinars scheduled, but as long as you're a member of the Montana Transition email list, you will receive notification as soon as we have additional webinars scheduled, so please be watching for that. We also post those on our website as well. Thanks again and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you.